which I find,
Okay.
Dave, I find it so much more interesting since Ron and I have made Aliyah. Yeah, it just has piqued my curiosity to get to understand so much more
Yeah,
about the Korbanot than when we lived in the States.
I know. Well, it's, once you um, are interested in Hirsch's approach to understanding Torah text, it opens up a whole new vista for understanding what it is that we're reading.
Mm-hmm.
True. I mean, all of this happened in Yerushalayim, first in the Mishkan, then in Yerushalayim, so we're much closer to it. Although
Right.
it doesn't exist anymore, but we've learned that everything in the Torah is to be decoded and to understand its ideas behind what the system of Korbanot is no different. So that's what Hirsch does, is to focus on what's the ideas behind it. Get an introduction to how you understand the Korbanot, but then to look at what the concept is behind it.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Now, first, to introduce the book of Vayikra, um, the title of the book, the title of all five books are taken colloquially, they're taken from the first word. So Breshit and Shemot and Vayikra, Bamidbar, Dvarim, it doesn't tell us what's in it. It basically gives the first word, and that's how we refer to it. But the Greek, the translation of the Torah gives us an idea of content. So in the book of Vayikra, in terms of its Latin title from the Greek, refers to the content, which is Levi, talking about Kohanim and Leviim. You remember that Kohanim are actually Leviim. It's Aaron's family is the Kohanim, and Aaron is a Levi. And the Torah itself refers often to Kohanim HaLeviim, the Kohanim who are Leviim. So the book that has to do with a lot of the uh, temple offerings, which is in Vayikra, the when they translated it to Greek, they called it Leviticus, meaning the book of the duties of the priest. But our tradition has its own titles in terms of content. For example, Breshit is called Sefer Yesharim, the book of the righteous ones, because it talks about the Avot and the Imahot. Um, and so Vayikra has also its own title. It's called Torat Kohanim. On the one hand, it refers to Leviticus. It refers to the laws of the Kohanim, or what the Kohanim are to do. But the word Torah has a double meaning. On the one hand, it's the ritual procedures. On the other hand, Torah means a teaching. And in the center of the book of Vayikra, of this book, in the center is a probably the most significant parsha of the whole book, which is Kedoshim, Parshat Kedoshim, and it's called, those who study it call it the holiness code, because it has to do with Kedoshim, uh, where the people themselves, Kedoshim Tihiyu, we are to be holy, Ki Kadosh Hashem Elokecha, because God is holy. And there's a whole bunch of laws that occur in the middle of this book that have to do with how is it that the nation and the individual can become holy, how we can become kadosh, because if you remember, at the covenant at Har Sinai, the deal was that we are to listen to God's voice and do all the mitzvot. And in return, we shall be a Am Segula, a God's special chosen people, and the Mamlechet Kohanim Begoy Kadosh. We are to be a kingdom of priests. In other words, all of us are to be Kohanim, as it were, and the whole nation, individual and national, should be a Am Kadosh, a holy nation. So the Torah Kohanim, in the midst of the book of Vayikra, Parsha Kedoshim, focuses on that. And when we get to that, we'll see what that means. What does it mean to become Kadosh? That's
And that,
another question. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I always associate now Vayikra and the entire Sefer with boundaries, how we maintain boundaries,
Mm-hmm.
private space, not just barging in, the very beginning, calling out to Moshe, and then through all the Parshiot, it's really seems that's a common theme.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because that's really also the essence of what the Korban system is, keeping in boundaries. And we'll see that as we learn it. But yes, you're right. It's about keeping within the boundaries of what the Torah is teaching us we should do, the boundaries of the mitzvot, what we call halakha, the path, the way we're supposed to walk, as it were.
I have a question too, if I may.
Yes. Sure.
You're talking about holy things, holy, the Kohanim and the Klei HaMikdash and all that, but we find frequently the expression Kol HaNogea Bahem Yikdash. Whoever touches, I don't know, the let's say the altar, or the certain things, whoever touches them will become holy. Now, how do we
it's a different use of the word. In other words, holy can be the whole idea of a part of one's character to become holy, but also the word is used in relation to the mikdash, as you say, and the better translation is not holy but sanctified. You become part of something that's sanctified, and what does that mean? It means that it's distinct and dedicated to the mikdash, which is not a good thing. In other words, we don't become holy by touching something that is dedicated to the mikdash, but rather we touch something that's sanctified, and that's not a good thing. We don't. In other words, it's to be in its own realm of kedusha, and we are impinging on the kedusha of the article or the thing by touching it when we're not supposed to touch it. So we come in the status of something that is separated, something that is distinct, but in a negative way.
Okay.
Okay, so what's the classical explanation of mitzvot, of korbanot? Korbanot, the classical comes from the Rambam, and he takes a very unique position. And the position is that the korban system that's presented in this book of Vayikra, and later, and also it appears again in the other books, was a form of foreign worship. In other words, this was what the Egyptians did. The Canaanites and the Egyptians, everybody in the ancient Near East, used a sacrificial system as the way of relating to their God. Their gods, remember, were gods of nature. They believed that there were different gods for different aspects of nature, gods of rain, gods of fertility, gods of war, gods of this and that. And each one had to be related to in some way, and you relate to it by offering sacrifices to it. So the Rambam says, well, but the people, you have to understand the audience. The audience that the Torah is dealing with in the Chumash Hirsch agrees with this completely, that the audience is critical. The audience are slaves, at least 3 generations of slaves. In other words, their parents and their grandparents, if we're talking about 210 years, it could be either 3 or 4 generations of slaves. That's all they know. They grew up under the Egyptian system. And so the way you relate to a god, to a power that's beyond your power, is through a system of sacrifices. That's what everybody did. So the Rambam says God takes that into consideration. He understands that people can't be asked to relate to him directly. They have no experience in that. There was no prayer system or anything. So they have no other system of relating to God other than through the form of sacrificial worship. And the Rambam brings a proof of God being sensitive to the point of who he's dealing with in the beginning of Beshalach. If you remember the first sentence of Beshalach, I'll say that in a second, but the Rambam says it's impossible. This is a quote from the guide. It's impossible to go from one extreme to another. The nature of man will not suddenly allow him to discontinue everything to which he has been accustomed. In other words, the Torah cannot tell people, don't use the sacrificial system, just talk to me. You can't. They can't comprehend that. And that's human nature, is you can't switch to something else that's not in your experience. And this is where he brings that pasuk in Beshalach. Vayhi b'shalach paro et ha'am, when Pharaoh sent the people out, God didn't take them immediately up north to Canaan. That was the Philistine country. In other words, if you look at a map, Ramses was in the north east of Egypt. It's where Gaza now meets Egypt, right? And it's Rafah, basically. It's in other words, you can get straight from Egypt to the coast of Canaan, which is Philistine country. Ashkelon, Ashdod was all Philistine, and God could have taken the Bnei Israel from Ramses after the Yam Suf, which is north. It's not the Red Sea down the bottom of Eilat. It's north. After the Yam Suf, he could have taken them straight up north, northeast, and gone right into Gaza, right, and then start from there. But God said, no, I can't do that. Because if I do that, Philistines are warriors and they're going to start fighting. And this is a bunch of slaves who don't know anything about fighting. And therefore, they're going to get afraid, turn around, and go back to Egypt because they're not going to be they're not trained as fighters, they're slaves. So Rambam says, you see, God himself recognizes that you can't turn people into a nation that can defend itself if they were brought up as slaves that had no possibility to defend itself. And so he says, first we're going to have to take a long route and develop a nation over a period of time. It wasn't going to be 40 years. It was going to be, a couple years that it was going to prepare the nation for going into Canaan, and you're not going to go by face to face to the Philistines. That would be sort of suicide. You're going to go all the way around to the Jordan and come in that way, and that's going to be a more realistic way of taking the people in.
So question, and how do we look at the sacrifices that the vote did?
Wonderful. You anticipate the Ramban, which is going to disagree with Rambam because of that. So let's look at it. Very good.
Okay.
We anticipated the next. But first, before we get there, there's the Rambam uses midrashic support. And he said, let's use an analogy. That the Bnei Israel coming out of Egypt can be compared to an unruly and indelicate prince. In other words, a boorish prince who was in the habit of eating forbidden fruit. That would be the sacrifices. So the father, the king, says, all right, I have a strategy. Instead of letting him go out and just joining his buddies and eating all this forbidden fruit, let him sit at my table and he'll learn to control himself on his own accord. He'll eat what I give him, he'll be at my table, and now I'm going to change his eating practices to that which is acceptable. So he says, thus Israel has been addicted to idol worship and sacrifice to demons. So God said, well, at all times, let them bring their offerings to my site at the tent of meeting, at the Ohel Moed, and they'll be saved from idolatry. In other words, bring it to God's temple and use the sacrifices. It's the same system. In other words, just like you eat both the forbidden food and also the appropriate food. So they're both eating. So these are both means of relating to God, but instead of doing it in the wrong way, which is the idol worship way and the pagan way, do it in my system, the system that I'm going to explain to you in the book of Vayikra, and you then transform the sacrificial system into that which is acceptable to God. That's his analogy to say why it is that God didn't take away the system of pagan worship, but rather changed it, transformed it into serving God instead of serving the pagans. Now the Ramban, Nachmanides, disagrees with this whole approach, and he uses the Torah itself as support. And this is what Sipporah was saying, that there are stories in Bereshit where the idea of offerings to God was valued intrinsically. In other words, it's not because it was some compromise to the pagans, but the idea of offering an offering to God was something that human beings did on their own. And it was accepted by God. And it was also pleasing to God. The term reach nichoach is used. The reach nichoach means something which is pleasing. So where was that? We have two examples in Bereshit of people offering that were not told to do it by God, but did it spontaneously as a way of relating to God. Which were the stories?
Well, don't we even start with Cain and Hevel?
Correct. Cain and Hevel. Remember, it says that Cain offered on his own. He did it spontaneously. He didn't do it. God didn't tell him to offer anything. He spontaneously offered. And what was the second one?
Well, I can think of Noah after
Noah.
the
How about,
flood.
yeah,
Correct.
Noah, right.
Noah did when he came out of the ark. Noah spontaneously, again, God did not tell him to. Spontaneously, he did an offering. And at that point, it was described as a reach nichoach to God, and because of that offering, God said He's not going to destroy the world anymore. And so, in other words, you have two stories which show that it's innate in human beings to want to offer something to God, and so therefore, it's not inherently pagan that has to be transformed. It's something that people do naturally, and it's not a negative thing. It's not a compromise. Thus,
Abraham.
offerings have, yes, right. Abraham also, he offered spontaneously. He built an altar and did offerings. Yitzchak and Yaakov did too. Thus, offerings have intrinsic value as a mode of worship and are not concessions to the worship styles of pagans. Furthermore, he argues, if our system was designed to reject the pagan gods, why should the ram and bull, Aries and Taurus, holy to Egypt, which they were raised under as gods in Egypt, why should they be acceptable in our system? In other words, we should say, if you want to transform the Egyptian worship to the worship of God, then prohibit using bulls and rams because they were the gods. Rather, you could use them for food, that's fine, but not worship, which denies their sacredness and divine powers. In other words, if the whole reason was to distinguish the or transform the pagan system from Egypt to the Jewish system, to God's system, then you should not include the ram and the bull, which was inherent, and we saw with the Egel Hazahav, which were inherent in the Egyptian system. You shouldn't be able to do that. So he's saying he doesn't agree with the Rambam. He says this is not using a pagan system and transforming it, but rather it's a natural human need to give something to God. And we should look at it that way. Now, the Yitzhak Arama, which is the Akedat Yitzhak in Spain, who is a philosopher and also a commentator, he shows the difference between. He's not denying. He's sort of following the Rambam. He's saying that our system is contrasting to the contemporary system of sacrificial worship, and he points out to what ours is not and what theirs is. So, for example, in the pagan system, you use offerings as bribes. You ask a favor or you appease the anger of the gods. So if there's no rain and you're assuming the god is angry at you, so you want to bribe him with some food in order to make him like you and give rain. Okay, we don't have such a system. First of all, we can't give a gift to God because God owns everything. There's nothing, you can't bribe somebody with something if he has it. So God is the God of the universe. He has everything. So giving him something is not going to do anything. And second of all, the concept of bribery is a perversion of justice. We are told not to use bribery under any circumstances because bribery is a perversion of tzedek. So it can't be that our system is a system of bribing gods for favor or trying to appease him when he's angry. Second possibility is that pagans give sacrifices as fines for disobedience. In other words, if you did something wrong, you feel guilty that you did it wrong and you want to pay a fine to make it right. Okay? So here in our system, one cannot assess the cost of an offense against God. Our offerings are fixed. In other words, they're not, the fines have to be different depending on how bad your offense was. And we don't have such a thing. We have all the sacrifices are basically fixed. Now, the only adjustment is if you're poor. If you're poor, you don't have to bring a very costly thing. But other than having to do with socioeconomic status, the offering for a chatas, the offering for an asham, are all fixed, and it has nothing to do with the degree of what you did wrong. That you did a lot wrong, you have to bring a higher sacrifice. If you did a little wrong, you have to bring a lower one. That's not in our system. And second of all, the fine system wouldn't be workable because it's not a deterrent for the wealthy. In other words, when we park our car in a place where you're not supposed to park, and we get 100 shekel ticket, that means something. Okay, that's like a punishment. That's a fine. But if I'm very wealthy and I parked there, and I said I couldn't care less. I'm looking for convenience. I want to park here. It's illegal to park here. I get a ticket. So what if I get a ticket? It doesn't mean anything to me. So that's not going to work. That system doesn't work in our system. So it's not a bribe. It's not a fine. So the third possibility is that sacrifices are providing food for the Kohanim. Because remember, when you bring an offering, in most cases, the Kohanim take a piece, part of that for themselves. But he says that also doesn't work, because that would imply that Kohanim profit from the sins of the people. In other words, the more that people have to bring offerings, the more that the Kohanim get. And it wouldn't make sense that the Kohanim profit by the sins of the people. And second of all, there is a system of feeding the Kohanim already. You have Truma and you have Meiser that provides food for the Kohanim and Levim and poor families. And so the sacrifices do not provide food. That's not their purpose. So what he wants to do is to show you that there's something else involved, and it's not a adjustment to the pagan system. There's something inherent in the system of sacrifices that are uniquely a message for us in relationship with God. And that's what we're going to look at next. The best explanation, Hirsch says what I'm going to show you, but in terms of presenting it in concise language, Professor Yecheskel Kaufman, a Bible scholar at Hebrew U, presented the Jewish notion of what the Korban system is in a very succinct way, although his language is a bit flowery, but this is, you'll see that it's saying something very critical. This is a quote from him. According to the biblical doctrine, sacrifices have no divine impact on, and God's fate does not depend on them. In other words, the sacrifices are not about God. The bringing a korban does not affect God's fate in any way, does not change God in any way. Rather, they are a gift to people and serve as a symbol and means of preserving knowledge of the divine, to hallow his name, and to remember his covenant. In other words, Korbanot is about us, it's a gift to us in our service of Hashem. It's a means of preserving ideas and concepts, not of affecting God in some way, not of making God do things for us or not do things for us, or to be angry or to be not angry. That's not the system. The system is a system that's focused on us, the one who brings it, and it serves as a religious, has religious value to the bringer. It's not about affecting God. The sacrificial cult is not an end in itself. The Korban system is not an end in itself, but a means to an end. If the person distorts it, it becomes a hollow frame, devoid of any meaning, a broken vessel. In other words, if people bring Korbanot and they bring it they bring it mindlessly. They bring it with no understanding of what it means and the purpose behind it. It's a broken vessel. It's hollow. It has no effect. This is what we read in Shabbat Chazon, when Yeshayahu was saying, God says, don't bring me all your animals. They mean nothing to me. What I want from you is to behave in the right way. I don't want you to just mindlessly bring animals and think that you're fine. So the cult does not represent man's kindness to God, but God's kindness to mankind. In other words, bringing offerings is not about God, it's about us. And so Hirsch agrees with this 100%, and the challenge is to understand how bringing an offering is to affect us. What is it about the offering that teaches us it's not about God, it's about us? So that's what we're going to look at next. So first of all, Hirsch says we shouldn't use the word sacrifice. Rather, we should use the word offering, because sacrifice is a forfeiture of something highly valued for the sake of something or someone considered to have a greater value. When you sacrifice something, it means you have something that's very highly valued and you give it to somebody else. Okay, it's like when the pagans were giving child sacrifices. What's the most valuable thing that you have? It's not a sheep or a cow. That's not the most valuable thing. It's your own child. And so if you sacrifice a child, you're taking something that's most highly valued and giving it to the pagan god, which is considered a higher value. That's not what the Korban system is about. Our Korban system is not about sacrifice. And because after all, we are a nomadic shepherd people, and if you take a sheep out of your flock of hundreds of sheep, no big deal. And we're not taking something highly valued. Or if you take some flour and you do a mincha offering, which is flour and oil. This is not about how highly valued the material is. Rather, as Ramban points out, excuse me, and Hirsch agrees with this, is that the korban comes from the word kufresh bet, meaning likarev, to come close. Likarev. So the korban system is a system of our relationship with God, of our attempts at wanting to come closer to God. That's the rubric under which we conceptualize the whole system of Korbanot. All the Korbanot are directed to the same purpose of coming closer in our relationship with God. According to Rav Hirsch, all the examples of offerings in the Torah were means to come closer in relationship with God. Now, how does that work? Sorry. The ultimate goal of the Jew and the Jewish nation, and we've said this before when we learned of the covenant at Har Sinai, is to achieve a covenantal bond with God. How do we do that? What's our part of the covenant that we agreed to at Har Sinai? By guiding his or her freely chosen behavior in accordance with God's expressed will. In other words, by listening to God, Shamoah tishmu'u el mitzvotai, you listen to God's voice. That's how we keep our part of the covenantal bond with God. That's the big picture, and the whole Korban system is focused on fulfilling that. The daily path of the Jew, which we call halacha, the path of the Jew who is committed to the covenant and seeks to be in close relationship with God, is characterized by choosing to act according to the mitzvot aseh, the positive mitzvot, things you are supposed to do, and to limit his or her actions according to the mitzvot lo ta'aseh, and according to those that were not to. In other words, we take all the mitzvot and we put them into two categories. Things we should be doing, and that's how we get closer to God, or things that we should not be doing, which also gets us closer to God. In other words, to do what we should do and not do what we shouldn't do. If, however, one does not behave as he ought to, or behaves as he ought not, he has committed a sin. The person is considered sinning when you don't do one of those two things. You don't act according to what you should do, or you violate the limits and you are over. We use that word over, an avera. You go beyond the limit of what you're not supposed to do. So you violate the limit. Those two things have the opposite effect. It distances us from our nearness to God. Okay, so it's important you get this in your head that all mitzvot represent things that we should do or things that we should not do. If we do what we should do, and if we don't do what we should not do, then we are advancing and building our relationship with God. But if we do the opposite, if we don't do what we should do, or we violate what we should not do, that distances us from our nearness to God. Okay, you got that? All right, let me use a analogy. I developed this a few years ago when I was teaching, and it's kind of cute, but it really demonstrates in an analogy what we're talking about. I think all of us had the experience one time in our life, especially when we were younger, going through an arcade and sitting in the race car thing. You remember doing that? Having going in an arcade and seeing this game of car races where you sit in a seat, you have an accelerator, you have a brake, and you have a steering wheel. Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
of course.
Good. Okay. So now let's use that as our analogy. First thing you have to do is start the game. So you got to put money in, right? So in our analogy, it's at the point in which we become responsible for our behavior at 12 or 13, the game starts for us, as it were. We don't have to put any money in it. The clock starts. And remember, when you put your money in, the game is limited in amount in time. It's 3 minutes or 5 minutes, it will go off. Okay, so, but the game starts, the clock starts at the point in which we become responsible for our behavior at our bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah age. Okay? The game is considered one's lifespan. We don't know how long that's going to be. When it starts, we do know if we put money in, it's going to be 3 minutes or 5 minutes or something. But in terms of the analogy, we don't know how long we're going to live. But the game starts at the point we're responsible for our behavior. The top score represents our spiritual potential. Everybody is different. Everybody has their own unique way of relating to God. Some people do it through an intellectual pursuit. Some do it through an emotional pursuit. Some do it through their chosen career. In other words, if they're business people or they're artists or they're musicians or they're teachers or whatever it is that's your career that's fulfilling to you, that is the way you're through that is the way that you relate to God. So everybody is different. And what our potential is different. In other words, we know the great sages in our history not only were brilliant, but had this photographic memory. And there's no way that most of us can reach our spiritual heights to be like one of the great Chazal and great scholars over there. That's not our role. We're not meant to match them. Okay, that's the way they were born. That's the way they took advantage of it, and that's their reward. That's fine. So everybody has a different potential score, and you can't judge anybody for what that is. Some people are very spiritual and relate to God, and they're not observant. That's their potential score. So that's one thing to bear in mind. There is a clock on the screen of the racing video, and that starts as soon as the game starts. And basically, our life is on a clock. We don't know how long it is. We are, I think, most of us who are learning together here are in the second half of our of our clock, somewhere between 60 and 120.
Right.
But the time goes on. I go to a shul that has a digital clock displayed in the front, and it's disconcerting because you see the minutes go by, and the minutes can never be recovered, and time just goes. It's kind of scary, but time goes. We don't pay attention to it all the time, but in order to pursue our spiritual development, we need to pay attention to time as the passage of time. Then on the screen there are laps, and we can use an analogy. Each lap is a year. Some of us hopefully have many laps that are gifted to us. Some have less. Some unfortunately die young, and some die, as an expected age, and some die when they're very elderly, which is fine. But in other words, it's not just minutes, but it's years, and it could be, the analogy could be the laps. Then there is a score. You see on the left, on the bottom. A score is where our current spiritual status is. In other words, if we have a potential, in this game, the potential is 12,000. If our score now is 7,300, so we got a ways to go yet. Okay, so everybody has to sort of pay attention to where we are on our spiritual journey, how close we are to getting as far as we need to be. Again, it's a consciousness. We have to have the consciousness of time, the consciousness of years, and the consciousness of where we are and how much we need yet to do. Yeah.
Yeah,
Carol?
excellent.
Okay, wait, we're not over yet. Now, you see the yellow arrow in front of our car. The yellow arrow represents the speed, which is how fast or how we're getting towards our goal, our movement. We control the pedal, the speed pedal, the gas pedal in this game. Okay, so the gas pedal represents the movement towards that goal, and how fast we go depends on us. But there's a second thing. Here, we have to stay in the lane.
Mm-hmm.
If we're going to gather more points, we have to stay within the boundary. And the red and white on the outside represents the boundary that we can't cross over. In other words, we have to remain on the road within those red and white boundary lines. If we're out of bounds, if you remember the game, if you've played the game, when your car goes out of bounds, you crashed it or whatever happened, then your score stops. Your time continues, but your score stops. In other words, it halts your movement, and you have to get your car back on the road in order to continue the race. And that also is the analogy of a chait, of when you do an aveira, you've gone outside the boundary, and your spiritual growth stops until you get it back in. We're going to go over this afterward in a minute. And then, if you remember the game, there are obstacles along the road. The game puts a car crash or a stone in the middle of the road, and you have to go around it, and so forth and so on. So the obstacles don't stop you, but it slows you down. It slows down your movement, but your challenge is to go around the obstacle as quickly as possible so that you can continue on, which represents, again, the obstacles that we are faced with in life that seem to block our ability to progress. These are bad when bad things happen, for example. It sort of blocks our progression forward. But we also, in the game, have bonus points. In other words, we have the opportunity to choose to do something really good, and that increases our points. The people who, when we choose to volunteer, to do mitzvot, or to go beyond what's required, then it's considered as bonus points, as it were, and we can increase our score beyond the natural path. Okay, so have this whole analogy in mind, and what Hirsch will do is to now apply it to the system of Korbanot. So the dynamics of offerings, the specific Korbanot, were designed to counteract distancing. But you can count the two things that cause distancing is if we go outside the boundary, which is a sin, and these are the chatat and the asham offerings. It's to get us back onto the path. We're outside the boundary, our progress is stopped, and we have to get back in. We can do that by teshuvah, but you also do it by the offerings. Okay? And the olah is an offering that is when we don't do what we're supposed to do. In other words, we miss an opportunity to advance. We don't push on the pedal. We're too slow. And we do an olah in order to make us go faster, as it were. You'll see that in a minute. And then the biggest category of offerings are shlamim. The shlamim offerings. By the way, everybody thinks that the sin offerings are the biggest category. It's not true at all. The sin offerings are very, very few. If we had time, we'll go to. We would explain. A chatat is for only sins that were done in which one gets karet for, which are very few. Because, as Hirsch says, everybody sins all the time. If you had to bring an offering every time you sin, we wouldn't do anything else but bring offerings. So you only bring a sin offering or a guilt offering for major chataim that were done inadvertently. Okay. But the biggest category is shlamim, and shlamim is brought by someone who wants to express gratitude, who wants to come nearer to God while in the condition of wholeness and well-being. Hirsch translated shalem, not a peace offering like everybody else does, but shalem means wholeness or completeness, not feeling deficient. Through the shlamim, brought by one's free will, the Jew wishes to approach God not because he wants something, or even to be forgiven for some type of sin, but simply to seek God's presence for its own sake. This type of shlamim is the most significant individual korban because it reflects a pure yearning to approach God from a position of strength, joy, gratitude, with no ulterior motives. It's an amazing difference between, for example, the Christian idea. When Christians go to church, or to shrines, they do it because there's something wrong. they feel guilty, they have to confess, or they are ill, or they are poor, and they go to shrines in order to get blessed. In other words, they do it from a position of deficiency and weakness. Our system is, our major system of Korbanot is when we are in a condition of well-being, of wholeness. We feel good, we feel happy, and we want to express gratitude to God in our happiness. I'll give you a very short example of that. We're not going through all the Korbanot, but an example. The Olah. Hirsch, first of all, does not translate Olah as a burnt offering like everybody else. He rejects that. And he says if you compare the names of the other Korbanot, such as Chatat or Asham or Todah, they all refer to the reason for bringing the Korban, not to a special procedure like burning it. So he doesn't call Olah a burning offering, but he calls it Olah as a way of ascending or going up. And it refers to a person who strives to progress further toward God's standards. In other words, it refers to putting your foot to the gas pedal, to progress further, purposely progressing further. Spiritual growth is also always referred to elevation, vertical development. So Rav Hirsch calls an Olah an elevating korban. And why do you bring an Olah? You bring an Olah for two main reasons. One is you missed an opportunity to do a mitzvah aseh. In other words, you should have done something, but you missed it. So you've caused your own block, obstacle in progress, and you want to get back, and you want to progress more. So you bring an Olah, or you can do it as a voluntary offering, just to show gratitude to God. It's like making a donation to the shul. You want to donate to the shul because you want to further the purposes of the community. That's the Korban Olah, which is why non-Jews can bring an Olah. It's the only Korban a non-Jew can bring, is an Olah, because it's a spiritual striving, and it's not directed to specifically to the mitzvot of what the Jews have to do. So an Olah is the gas pedal offering. The offering is brought for yearning to get closer to God, or for negligently not doing what one ought to do, mitzvahs aseh. Let's say you miss davening, or you want to help support a needy person, you want to give tzedakah through the shul. That's an Olah offering. The shlamim, the peace of mind offering, in contrast to Olot, which were completely consumed by the fire, the thing that characterizes a shlamim is that the one who brings it takes home some of the meat of the animal that he's bringing in order to make a festive family meal. The Korban Pesach is the best example of a shlamim, that we have a Seder meal. We have a festive meal to celebrate something. All the shlamim are to celebrate something. According to Rav Hirsch, the shlamim is brought from a feeling of being completely satisfied with life. There's nothing lacking in our circumstances, and therefore it's a celebratory offering. A korban todah is a shlamim, and in all of the shlamim, the korban chagiga, when you 3 times a year, when you go to the mikdash for the celebration of the chagim. Also, that's the chagiga is a festive meal. Anytime there's a festive meal that you want to celebrate something out of gratitude or out of celebration, then you bring a shlamim. And this, as I said, is the largest category of korbanot. So the system is one in which we can imagine, if you use the analogy, one is the system of the Korbanot is always focused on trying to get closer to God, closer in our relationship to God, on the are different for different people. Everybody has their own potential. Everybody has their own path, but that's the whole purpose. And the korban serves two purposes: either to accelerate, to make us go faster within the limited time that we have to reach our spiritual relationship to God, or to get back on track, that to acknowledge the fact that we're blocked. We can't advance if we're outside the boundary, and we want to repair that. We want to get back on the road so that we can advance, and that's the korbanot of the chatat and the shlamim and all of those that, I mean, the chatat and the asham, those that we bring for doing something that we shouldn't have done. So the combination of the two have the same goal in mind: to move towards a closer relationship with God. So that is that is Hirsch's explanation of korbanot. Now he goes to all kinds of detail of why you bring a particular animal, why you choose a lamb instead of a ram, and so he goes through all the details and what the korban mincha is for. It's too much for us to do now. Maybe we can get back to it if we have different, if we don't have another topic that's going to take preference. But in any case, that's our introduction.
Thank you for a
Back
most
off.
thoughtful, interesting, and really insightful. This was a great class.
Great.
So happy you recorded it for other people to benefit from it.
I have, and I hope that they'll see it and they'll learn as well. So
Great.
I'm